With me, Carly. Hope you are all well, witches. I don't have a book review for today's show. I'm currently finishing up our Literary Witches Coven read. If you would like to join us in our book club, our book for May is Entering Hecate's Cave by Cindy Branham. The Literary Witches Coven is part of my Patreon on the Witches Institute, and for £6 per month you receive tons of witchy content, from hedge witch studies through to meditations, a monthly Patreon podcast episode, grimoire sheets for episodes of the White Witch podcast, access of course to our book club, witchy get-togethers via Zoom, and access to our witchy community over on Discord. You can find a link in the show notes. It has been running for over a year and a half now, so you can access tons of witchy content when you sign up. I am so excited to bring you today's episode. I am joined by the wonderful Kate Ray, who I first came across on the TV show Help My House is Haunted, and also on the amazing podcast. It's actually my favourite podcast, and I definitely recommend you give it a listen, called Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast. I keep referring to Kate as Kate Faye instead of Ray. She really is a woman of the fairies. This is one of my favourite guests who we've had come on. I gleaned so much information from Kate and her work related to the Fae, and I think you might too. Join me after the break to talk all about Faery Encounters with the wonderful Kate Ray. Welcome back. So I am so excited because I am here with Kate. Now, Kate Ray is a paranormal investigator and writer. She has featured in The Haunted magazine. She has been on radio and TV programs such as Help My House is Haunted, a practicing witch and a student of parapsychology, which gives her opportunities to examine the field from both perspective of believer and skeptic. Kate has a passion for learning and teaching about working with energy in the field of paranormal, from protection to spiritual pathways. But her true passion lies in the realms of the Fae. You can find Kate over on her amazing YouTube channel, Hair in the Hawthorn. She also creates some amazing, beautiful mushroom craft that you can find on Etsy. And I will link all of her details in the show notes. But welcome to the show, Kate.
Oh, bless you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, I'm so excited. I'm going to try not to fangirl too much. So I first came across Kate on Help My House is Haunted, which is one of my favourite programmes. I'm not even lying, honestly. We've had many conversations on Patreon about this show. In the same week, I also came across you on one of my favourite podcasts. It was like the synchronicities were there, the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast. And I was like, who is this woman? I must contact her. She's amazing. See if she'll come on. And I recently came across you on Spirit Talk with Chris Fleming. He is one of the psychics from the earlier seasons of Help My House is Haunted. And you were talking all about gnome encounters, which was a great episode. So one of the things we were talking about over on Patreon, because we've been talking about you, your ears have probably been burning, talking about your YouTube channel. And one of my Patreons, Becky, one of our witches, says every time she watches you on YouTube, she always sees things in the background like orbs or just things flitting about. And it made me smile because that is exactly what Chris Fleming said on his podcast that he did with you whilst you're on the episode itself.
And I know, like, I've seen it myself. The Fae seem to be really drawn to you. Are you happy to share perhaps on your first encounter with the Fae, or just any encounters that you might be happy to share with us?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to share them all. I'll go back to the anomalies that happen when I'm zooming with people, and it's usually people when I'm chatting on video chat about the fairies and about the paranormal. And I was saying to you just before we came on that one of the things is that I try to keep myself grounded and skeptical and critical in thinking about these kind of things. And there is often times when I'll see something on the screen, but I don't actually see it with my own eyes, which is a paranormal investigator I just put down to, it's a water droplet, it's, you know, it's a bit of dust, a bit of lint, something like that. But there are occasions when I actually see them physically with my own eyes, and they're just phenomenal. It takes my breath away every time it happens, every time I actually see them in the room. And I would like to think it's fairy energy. It is definitely some kind of energy. And I was just disclosing to you about when I have those phenomena go off downstairs in the property that I'm in, my partner oftentimes will have things occur in other places, other rooms in the house, which you know, sometimes freaks him out. So there was one particular time, and I can't remember who. I think it actually turned up on the audio of the Zoom, and I can't remember who I was interviewing for the YouTube channel, but there was a really loud knock on the back door, and you can't get to our back door because it's gated and locked. I came down after the Zoom to my partner freaking out because somebody had literally knocked on the door while I was having this Zoom meeting. So there are things that go off, and they definitely become more interested when I'm talking about the subject with people, and especially people who are believers, who are interested. We usually get bits of phenomenon going off.
Do you think that the more you do you think it's like the more you talk about them, the more they gravitate towards you as well?
Yeah,
people
I think
in general.
Yeah, I don't think it's so much gravitate. I think when people start, I think you put out a different energy pattern when you start believing and investing your time in these things. I know from the ghost hunting side of what I do that the more you go out ghost hunting, the more liable you are to encounter other phenomena that goes off. And I think you open yourself up in a way that's more attractive to them, and also gives these energies more energy to be able to maybe materialize or to interact with you. So I think it's a bit of give and take, you know, energy wise between the two.
I agree with that, because I used to do a lot of spirit work. I worked with a psychic quite closely for quite a long time, and I absolutely agree with you. And towards the end, I kind of wasn't grounding myself as well as I could. And I started to have a lot of, well, let's just say unpleasant experiences at home, which is my fault because I wasn't necessarily doing the work. I got a bit cocky with it. But yes, I agree with that. And I can imagine the same with the Fae, yes, you know, and the line of work that you're in. I'm sure that they are very aware that you're sort of, doing all this work and talking about them and so on. I was really curious about, if you don't mind talking about this encounter, because I found it fascinating. But on Joe's podcast, you were saying about, I think it was your first encounter, which just amazed me. Are you happy to talk about that or share that one with us?
I am,
I loved it.
Yeah, I mean, do you want the longer version or the potted version?
Oh, we've got as much time as you've got, Kate, so you choose.
So it happened down in Oxfordshire, near Wayland Smithy, in the White Horse. I was at the time I was very much interested in all Fortean subjects, sort of anything of strange phenomena, supernatural, but I didn't really invest my time and my research as I did later on in life into it. So it wasn't something that was ever really at the forefront of my mind constantly as it is nowadays. And I had a group of friends who very much kind of were, you know, had that alternative view about life. And we were sat around bored, being very, very skint sort of teenagers, early 20s, on a Friday night. and we had nothing really to do. And a friend of mine said, I've got this book. And he pulled this book off the bookshelf, and I later found out it's the Magical Atlas of Britain. Mm-hmm. So we had this crazy notion, as you do when you're that age, that we were just going to open the book randomly on a page and blindly run a finger down the page, and wherever it stopped, that's where we were going to go that evening. Bearing in mind, it was getting late. It was getting late, and it landed on the Uffington horse, the Uffington white horse, which is, I think, actually a dragon, but that's a different story. So we all piled into this, a friend of mine's very old clapped out car, and made our way down from Nottinghamshire to Oxfordshire. And we stopped over in the car, tried to get a few hours kip down a farmer's track, to which we were woken up before the dawn by the farmer saying, you kind of can't park here, you know, you're going to have to move on. So we asked him where the white horse was, and he pointed us up a route, and we actually took the route over the back of the white horse. So if you come down the main road, you can actually see it from the road, but this was the backside. And it was summertime, but there was a really thick mist. And we were coming up over the brow of the hill, and we're all complaining that we couldn't find where the Uffington horse was. To somebody in the party, because we were kind of scattered about, shouted, "We're on it." And we kind of looked down on our feet, and there was the outline, you know, the chalk outline. And we stood there for a minute, and a pocket of the mist lifted up. I mean, it started off as this really incredibly magical day, and a pocket of the mist lifted, and there was a herd of deer just in the middle of the Uffington horse, and they hadn't heard or seen us or smelt us, and vice versa. And it was one of those, you know, spine-chilling moments that just seemed to go on forever, but obviously didn't. And then they kind of bolted back into the mist, and that was the kind of start of you know, the slight weirdness, the things that you remember. So we decided to sit on the head of the white horse and just watch the mist lift and watch the sun come up. And we'd also seen in this particular book that there was a place called Wayland Smithy. Wayland Smithy is a Neolithic burial ground, burial chamber. And we were going to head down there, and there's a very ancient route from the White Horse that proceeds down to Wayland Smithy. And I can't remember off the top of my head how long the walk is, but as a grumpy teenager who hadn't had a great deal of sleep, it seemed like a really long walk, but it's probably not. And I was lagging behind, so I was with a party of 4 guys who were striding on ahead, and I was lagging behind, and the sun was definitely warming up as we were going. So it's a beautiful bright morning, and I kept hearing this kind of, it was a cross between singing, whistling and humming, and the only way I've ever been able to describe it, it sounded like the Clangers. So if there's anybody of a certain age who remembers the Clangers, which was a kids show.
Yeah. I know. Yeah, we had little toys of those in our house. Yeah, I remember well.
It sounded like that. It sounded like that kind of, but it was en masse. There wasn't just it wasn't just the odd one or two. Wow. It sounded like a lot. And when we were walking down to Wayland Smithy, it was a very narrow track, and the hedgerows started at sort of probably just lower than shoulder height. And it was like a grassy verge up to the bottom of the actual hedgerow. And so I decided that I was going to stop to see if I could locate where these noises were coming from. And every time I stopped, the noises stopped. This kind of singing stopped. I then carried on, walked on, and as I was walking on, I kind of took a dive to my side, to my left-hand side, and tried to part the grass where where one of the noises were coming from. To which I saw something scatter. I didn't get a good look at it. So I walked on a little bit further, and then I literally jumped in the grass and parted it. And my hands were either side of this creature, and it was probably the size of a large toad.
Yeah.
And had that kind of shaped body, but had a very mousy head. And I remember looking at it. It was on all fours and it had turned its head and was kind of peering at me. And I remember not thinking, oh, that's a strange creature. But my first thought was, it's got tweed trousers on. And it had this very, very small, minute pair of tweed trousers on with a pair of red braces holding them up.
Yeah, yeah.
And I looked, it screamed, I screamed, and it bolted off into the hedgerow. And I kind of chased on to try and get caught up with friends of mine. And I said, my first thing I said was, did you hear the whistling? Have you heard the noises? To which they said no. I then told them about the encounter, thinking in my innocence that they would want to, help me search out these things, they would come and help me. I got an absolute barrage of abuse for it. I was the butt end of the joke for the rest of the day about how I'd seen this, what was termed a gnome. We termed it, it was termed a gnome. So I didn't speak to anybody about it for probably about 10 years after, because I just felt so stupid, because I'd never come across anybody who'd actually had physical encounters of this nature. I'd heard people say, oh, I've seen an apparition, or I've seen poltergeist activity, or I've seen a UFO. I never actually heard anybody say that they'd seen something along these lines. So it was very, very special. It was a very, very special encounter, that one was.
And when you said, just coming back to your account there, did you feel instinctively it was a gnome, or did that come from kind of like looking into things thereafter, or was it just a feeling that came up like, oh, it's a gnome?
I think for me that it was the nearest name that I could come up with, because I had a sense that this thing was from the earth. I had a sense that it was, it wasn't an airborne creature, it wasn't near water. It was very earthy looking. So gnome was definitely my instinct. I later renamed it the sod, because it looked like it was a sod of earth. That's the kind of feeling that I got from it, that it could flatten itself down and be stealth, in the hedgerow bottom. But it wasn't that I associated the name later on, or it didn't give me any, I know people have encounters and they get telepathic images or conversations, but the only thing that I got from this creature was it had this kind of, oh shit, she's seen me, panic about it, and it bolted off. It was amazing.
But it was almost like curious about what you were doing and vice versa, kind of like following you along and trying to see where you're going and what you're doing. And that's what I wonder, like, do they kind of just get curious about us, and that's how we end up seeing them sometimes? But I'm going to kind of ask you some bits on this, but I do think, I completely get you, and I know that you've obviously been on Joe's podcast, but I've had not as amazing and magical a kind of fae experience. Mine was quite scary, but I know what you mean about talking about it, because when I was actually with somebody else when I had mine, and it was my partner who was really skeptical, and he was really skeptical, and the fact that he felt it was a fae sighting, but he would never have spoke to anybody about it for just fear of ridicule. But for me, even like all the work I do and all the all the stuff I do linked to witchcraft and the fae and all of this, even when I've spoke to people about it, have still felt like nervous, because people aren't as open. And again, you working in the paranormal investigation side of things, people are really open to that. But a lot of the fae sightings, we recently had a Patreon night and we were talking about experiences that we'd had, and it was like, for some of our witches, it's the first time they'd ever had the chance to talk to anybody about it, because they haven't, not all of us have got very open-minded people in our day-to-day life that you can say, oh, that happened, but I think it's, so I completely get you, and kind of like the ridicule, but what a magical experience, you know, like what an amazing.
Yeah.
I also wondered, like, with the journey, when you got there, was this around like dawn or dusk, or can you remind me on the time?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely dawn, and I didn't get the feeling that they were following me or curious of me. I got the feeling that they thought that I couldn't hear them. It was almost like they were singing a dawn chorus themselves, that they were sort of singing to each other as they were busying themselves. And I don't think they expected to be heard. So when my footsteps stopped, they stopped because they thought, oh, somebody's listening. And I certainly don't think that this thing wanted to be seen. And I don't think it was curious at me. It looked petrified. It probably mirrored my own look because I was petrified. Not because it was a horrible thing, just the obscurity of it. It was very surreal, very surreal.
This is a very open-ended question. Do you think that do you think there are certain people that have got the sight? Because that's always something that's always been written about in a lot of folklore, and, you know, certain people that can see fae or just all manner of things. Or do you think that it's like a kind of crossing over of two realms, and sometimes it goes a little bit bandy?
I think it's sometimes a combination of the two. I mean, when I talk about all things paranormal, and especially when it comes to psychic abilities, or, you know, clairvoyance, clairaudience, etc. I do believe that everybody has the ability. And I think that when we are children, we have a very natural ability that's very easy. And as we grow older, we get jobs, we become more materially grounded. I think that antenna kind of, you know, doesn't work as well or isn't as active. But I think that there are certain people who are drawn to keeping their energies open and to be curious. And I think that that's where, you know, when people are seers. I mean, I'll tell you a little bit about an example of this. For instance, when I started in paranormal investigation, I was curious about, you know, protecting myself on an energetic level, but also learning mediumship. I'm not a natural medium, and it's not something that I'm particularly drawn to, but it's something that I wanted to try and develop. And actually, I was encountering then more fairies than I was the spirits of the dead. So I put my antenna up thinking I was going to get, you know, ghosts of haunted properties sort of conversing with me, or you know, having interactions with, and it was the fae that were coming through. So I don't know how that happened. It's not because I didn't ask for it. I was asking for, but I think it's because I was asking for any energies in the property to come forward, and the fairies just kind of went, hello.
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely love that. And actually, this kind of leads me on to a question I want to ask you about. Can you talk about the fairy encounter that was on the episode of Help My House is Haunted, the episode that you featured on? Because it was a case of, like, this came up and the investigators were like, oh, what, you know, and I remember Barry going like, right, guys, this is nothing, I know who to call, and then you came on and that was it. But can you kind of talk us through, like, that episode, because that was fascinating, and there's a few things off that I wanted to sort of delve into also, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually part of Barry Guy's paranormal group. So I'm a paranormal investigator for his events and for private cases that come up through him. So I'd known Barry, I think a few years before, you know, I've been working with him for a couple of years before that episode. And he was somebody, and still is somebody, who is very, very open. So when I was going out investigating with the team and saying I was coming across these other energies, these other entities that weren't human but weren't on the demonic side, that I was putting into the fairy category, he was very supportive of me continuing that kind of work and interaction and figuring things out, especially for people who were in haunted properties. So he knew how I worked, and he knew I could tap into this side of things. I was also at the time really kind of focusing and really fascinated with remote viewing. And I would often use our investigations as a team to do remote viewing. So before we went to investigate a new property or a new building, whether it be for events or private, I would always ask for a picture of the front door, just for my own training. And I would go into the property, not knowing anything about the property, just given the front door, and just sort of search around on a psychic level to see what was there. And it absolutely fascinated me, because I would get features of the building that were spot on, or features of a building that had been, you know, renovated or knocked down, that kind of thing. And I'd also encounter some spirits occasionally, but generally, if there was fairies about, I'd encounter them. So it was one probably midday afternoon, I can't remember what day it was. Barry phoned me up and said, "We've got this case. I'm on set, and I need you to have a look at this property." And I asked him not to tell me anything. He sent me a photo of the couple's front door, and I sat for probably about an hour-ish and did a deep guided meditation through the property. And I literally opened the front door, and there was this, it was only a kind of a fuzzy black mass, because it was moving around so quickly. And it was probably just under waist height, and it was literally going in and out of rooms, and it was frantic, absolutely frantic, this energy. And I eventually, this is psychically got it to calm down, and it came and stood directly in front of me, very, very directly in front of me. And it was kind of spiky. It was presenting like a treant, but spiky, spiny. And he was ranting at me, and I didn't understand what he was saying. It was very, very fast. And I later found out that it wasn't British that he was talking. And I finally got him to calm down. And as he was calming down, he morphed shape into this small, pot-bellied, slightly hook-nosed, balding little creature. And he kept saying, "My tree. It was my tree," you know, and he was very, very angry. And he gave me an image of an orchard, which was the image of the I mean, if anybody, I'm sure your listeners do, but understand how you sort of psychic levels work, we're often given symbols and images as opposed to words.
Yes.
So he showed me my next door neighbour's orchard from when I was a child. So I instantly knew that there was an apple tree involved and an orchard, and that's what he was mad about. And he basically said, you know, they've really, really pissed me off. You know, that was the bottom line. They'd really upset him. So I got back to Barry and I said, "I don't know what it's worth, Barry, but this is what I've come across." And he was like, "You're joking." He was so excited. And I didn't know anything about it. He said, I'll call you back. We've got to put you online." And he called me back, and we did that telephone call that was then part of the series. Now, what happened with that particular episode, because the narrative of the episode has to fit in with a time constraint, they left bits of it out. And of course, in the episode, we see that the couple had chopped down a tree in their current back garden, which had further pissed this thing off. But they had lived in France, and they'd picked this energy up from France, and they did have a large orchard, and they had chopped down a tree because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing to them where it was. And it was this pixie's own tree. And it had followed them all the way from France to Devon. Wow. I spoke to the couple probably about a year later. They'd had virtually no activity for about a year. And then it started picking up again. It wasn't the haunting side that was picking up, but it was very much this pixie-esque behaviour that was picking up again. And I asked them, I said, you know, have you ignored him? You know, and they were like, they'd started off and they were doing everything that I'd kind of asked them to do. You know, they said they were sorry, and they planted a tree, and, you know, they were leaving him gifts, and it kind of trailed off. I said, you've got to keep doing it. I think you're stuck with him, you know.
Yeah. He's come all the way from France.
He can't get back. Yeah. So you're stuck with him.
Oh my goodness. That episode was amazing. Yeah, I mean, they were kind of like, so I remember you saying about the extra bits that went on the show. They were like, you know, cutting trees up left, right, and centre.
Yeah.
But honestly, I found something I really wanted to ask you in relation to what they were experiencing in the house. So am I right in this, or did I kind of misconstrue this? But I've also sort of read it and heard it. I mean, I read a lot on the Fae, but I'd love your take on it. So on that episode, I know they're experiencing like poltergeist behaviour, and they had that little stove. There was this like little old-fashioned stove, and there were all things going on with that. And so am I right in thinking that sometimes the Fae, you know, they can demonstrate poltergeist behaviour in someone's house? And you know, as a paranormal investigator, would you say that perhaps at times when that might be going on in someone's house, it could possibly be that it might be Fae, it might not necessarily be, you know, the spirit of a dead person or someone linked to the building? You know, can I put that to you and see what your take is?
Yeah, I mean, it can be that straightforward. I mean, it's a little more complex in the fact when you've got human energies. You know, you can range from, you know, your telekinetic energies of teenagers right the way through to people, you know, manifesting egregores and tulpas. But I think if we see it this way, that the word poltergeist is a modern word, and prior to that, the fairies would have been blamed for that kind of activity. So anything being moved, any apportation of coins or keys, people would ask the fairies. You know, they would say, I need my keys back, can you please bring them back? What I am wary of and careful of is that there is a very fine line between the mischievous and verging on malevolent behaviour of the Fae, and then we get into the darker sort of, whether they be ancient earth spirits or whether they be, you know, demonics, whatever your belief is. And that there is a fine line. The thing for me within the paranormal community, and I go out and do talks fairly regularly now for paranormal communities, is how you deal with fairies is very, very different to how you deal with the spirits of the dead and how you deal with demonics. So if you're trying to rid your house of fairies, getting the good Bible out and reading verses and doing very general exorcisms on a property, he's not going to really cut the mustard with them, you know. I mean, there's fairy folklore that says, you know, the Fae don't like it and they don't like church bells. From my encounters, they're not bothered about religion. It's not something that really enters into their head about religion. They think it's slightly nonsensical, I think. But yeah, definitely with the poltergeist activity, I think mischievous behaviour can, I would say a lot of the time, you know, looking into whether it's fairy or not and dealing with it as fairy would be probably a good point of call if you're experiencing that.
That's really interesting. And you touched on this, but I wanted to ask you about the concept of the imp and if they are a form of the Fae at all, or if they are, I don't know, like, do you consider them as a form of earth elemental or like a, you know, darker version, or do you have, would you say they are of the Fae?
Simple answer, straight answer for me is yes, and this is very much from a personal perspective. I know that there are staunch folklorists and people who work in different ways with Fae that have very clear-cut views of what fairies are. But for me, the absolute range of different variations within the Fae are absolutely huge. There is as many as different types as there are animals in the animal kingdom, and the difficulty comes, and I know the word imp became very, very popular because it does describe a behaviour, it does describe something that's mischievous to the point of malevolent. Now, for me, imp isn't necessarily a specific energy or species of fairies. And who knows, I could be wrong. I could be wrong about this, but it's more a descriptive of behaviour. And I think it's a very, very good description of behaviour that we see within that realm. I mean, what names we give to them and how we try as human beings to classify, because that's how we know to learn and to research. But I think when you're talking about fairies, they are trickster, they are changeable, they are shape-shifting, they are different energy levels. They, you know, to try and categorize them for me is just like it's playing with mercury. You can never get it into a solid form, you know, but which is one of the lovely things about working with them.
And really as well, I mean, I don't know if I agree with you on, I did want to see what you thought, but I'm kind of the thought that the imp was a fae, and the kind of, it's all got a bit distorted, and like you say, you know, you sort of got the Christian aspects of things and using the Bible to get rid of things, and then it becomes little demons. And I just always thought they were more of the fae, and it was like, like you say, just disruptive, mischievous behavior. I still have got a lot to learn on this front. I mean, I'll probably be here, you know, we could be here a whole lifetime, like learning all of this stuff and never really know anything. I mean, you know, tons on this. But in terms of the fae as well, there is no real, like, I don't think I'm wrong in saying this, but logical, you know, or rationale, or, you know, is that trickster energy, and there's no good or bad with them either. If I don't think I've got that wrong. I don't know. I mean, that's always kind of what I've come across. No,
they're definitely not like human beings where they have it, you know, an intention to go out and to be hurtful or harmful. It usually that comes about because humans have done something to upset them, that kind of behavior comes out. It's like, you know, you don't look at a horse and think, oh, that horse, you know, all horses are bad, you know, or all horses are good, or, you know, there's a whole range of variety of personalities in every animal in the animal kingdom, right the way across the board. And, you know, animals don't intentionally do inherently bad things. That's a very very human trait to do that. And we do, you know, we do humanize the fairies, much to probably their hilarity, but we do try and humanize them, and they're not. They're very separate energies from human beings.
We had a interesting conversation on the podcast with a chap called Mark Hughes, who is a paranormal investigator, and he was talking about, and actually this is something I've just bought a book on this that I'm going to kind of get into. I can't remember what it's called, but it looks at, and you know, I still need to read it, but it looks at the possibility that there could be links with the fae and aliens, and perhaps, you know, when we go back to old accounts of where there were like children that were abducted in like the Tudor times, and, you know, hundreds of years ago, and they turn up miles and miles away. You know, some say, well, actually, maybe they could have been aliens, you know. I don't know if you've ever gone down that line, or, you know, gone down that rabbit hole with this, but is this anything that you've ever riffed on, or you're happy to kind of talk about? Have you got any theories on it?
I tell you what, God, I've gone down the rabbit hole, I've gone into the Warren, I've bought the t-shirt, and I'm still there. Let me tell you.
On it, but I just was really curious, because I don't want to kind of like distort things too much, but I wondered what your concept on that was, because I do wonder if, like, some of these, you know, the little Johnny was taken away and turned up, you know, 10 miles away, and actually it was the fae, but a lot of it can be possible to be an alien abduction.
I think one of the theories that I subscribe to, because it's the easiest one I think I can get to wrap my head around. There's a really good book if anybody's interested in the connectivity of all 14 supernatural and paranormal. It's absolutely mind-blowing. It's a great body of work by a guy called Josh Cutchins, who I had the pleasure of interviewing. And his book, literally, I have to read a chapter, go away and mull it over for a month, because it is just all these connectivities and how everything is interconnected. But I think one of the theories that I do, I particularly enjoy about that, the correlation between the fairies and aliens, is the fact that we can only understand these etherical beings in a context of the time that we're living. So we may see classic grey aliens because it's easier for us to digest that we're being visited by classic grey aliens in today's modern society than it is by a winged creature that flutters in through the window. So it may be a case of our psychological state interpreting these encounters, or it could be that they shapeshift into ways that we can understand what is happening and what their intention is. It is a massive subject, fascinating subject, and there are people out there who cover it incredibly well, but it's not just a rabbit hole, it's a warren and a half, let me tell you. And it's a really good one. It's a really good subject.
You've actually got some good interviews on your really good interviews on your YouTube, actually amazing. And obviously I'll link the channel, but I know you've got one on there that goes into the alien side of things.
Yes.
But I did want to ask you, that's a really good point, because that I will definitely get that book. I'll definitely peruse that. Are there any books that, because there are a lot of books on the Fae and a lot that you probably think, no. What ones would you heartily recommend that you think would be a good place for people to start to get a real good idea of them?
I think I would, and I know again your listeners will understand this, I think I would go for intuition. I mean, my very first introduction to what I really understood to be fairies was the work of Brian and Wendy Froud, and their beautiful drawings and the puppets that they build. And for me, that was just seeing those pictures and thinking, yeah, that's exactly what they're like, was my first real kind of pinpoint moment, early teens, about saying, yeah, there are people out there who understand what these beings are. I would go for your intuition, because even those books that I've picked up, and they're a bit twee for me. I mean, I tend to like not working on the dark side, sorry, but understanding this more mischievous behaviour. That's what really draws me. So oftentimes you'll get very light, airy books that are about working with fairies on that end of the spectrum, which don't really appeal to me. I would say one of the books that is, it was a bit of a shocker for me, really. I picked it up many years ago. It's called the Faery Bible. And I picked it up. I like to have a range of different books on the bookshelf on subjects. The front cover is always highly disappointing to me, because the actual subject matter in it and how it's dealt with is brilliant. So it's basically a dictionary, an A to Z of different characters that you may sort of come across in the fairy realm, and that's a very good one. There's also a book which I've never been able to get hold of, and now is well out of print, by Catherine Briggs. Yes. And that's I think that's the Encyclopedia of Fairies. I could have got that title wrong. It's hundreds and hundreds of pounds now to get a copy of that, which is unfortunate, but that's pretty much a staple go to for a lot of the fairy folklorists that I know. In terms of books, for me, I think personally, I develop more from having conversations with people, from listening to encounters that people have had, from working on my own intuition, and using books to pick up and flick through. I've recently bought, and I must mention this because Dr. Simon Young is such a good guy, and I've had the opportunity to talk to him on a number of occasions. He has recently brought out the Fairy Census Volume 1. So I think it was 2014 to 17. I could have got that completely wrong. Could be 2017. You have to excuse me. But there was a fairy survey that went out, literally worldwide. It was open to anybody to log an encounter, and that's been in PDF file, available for free on the internet, so people can find it if you put in Fairy Census. He's recently, over the last week, published it in book form, which I was begging him for ages, because I don't like reading on the internet. And that, for a source of modern day encounters, is fantastic. He's just completing his second census, so if anybody wants to go and log an encounter that they've had, it's completely anonymous. Again, if you put in Fairy Census, it will take you to a very simple questionnaire where you can log any encounters. And for me, from a research perspective, I find those kind of cases absolutely fascinating, because these are real encounters with real people, and collated in a way that you can flick through and understand. So I'm sorry, I've completely deviated from where the question was.
No, you haven't, Kate. I'm fascinated, because I was going to say, right, the fairy census, you are so right. I have seen this before, and I'm excited to hear he's now published it, because I've actually looked at this, and it's really funny you say that, because I have found that the more I read that and different encounters on just, you know, all manner of sites and websites and Reddit and all sorts, the more similarities I've seen, and especially in how they've looked, you know, that's really kind of been for me something I haven't got out of books. Absolutely agree with you. I've got a range of twee books. I've kind of started. I'm still still a very new area for me. You know, I'm sort of going off in different rabbit holes now with like the alien concept and all of that. Now, I know the Catherine Briggs book. There's lots of kind of quote like references to her book and you know, quotes I've seen in other Fae books recently, actually. So I've only just come across her Encyclopedia of Fairies. But if I'm right, the Brian and Wendy Froud books, was it that he had the Fae ask him to like depict them, and he's said to show how they are really like, and they are actually meant to be like really good? Have I invented that? Have I plucked that out?
No, yeah, absolutely in the ballpark. I have had the pleasure on a couple of occasions of going to their house, and spent a couple of weekends with them many years ago. And the first time I went, I was so awestruck by Brian that I couldn't talk to him for the first day. I just couldn't get my words out, because he was a big, massive hero sort of growing up through his work. But I did get to chat to him quite in depth on the second time that I visited them about that, and he talked to me about he would go out for walks in nature, and he would often just sit, and objects such as rocks or trees would kind of grow and morph into the spirits that were contained in them or around them. He also said that some of his fairy paintings were based on people he felt were of the Fae realm, so humans that he felt that transversed that Fae realm, like Wendy. You know, his wife Wendy is often depicted in his paintings. But the most fascinating bit for me was, he says that oftentimes he'll be working really hard on painting in his studio, and he will have the fairies come in and bother him to be painted. And he kind of has to tell them, you know, wait your turn, you know, I'm kind of busy. But they are so matter of fact about it. You know, it's like, you know, having stray hedgehogs coming into the house. They're just so matter of fact. They're lovely people.
Oh, what an experience. Honestly, I could just feel these little Fae like lining up, like, do you mean now paint me like one of your French girls?
Yeah, I can imagine them doing that as well, definitely.
Yeah, I can actually, but yeah. I was going to ask you, when I think of the accounts of like the wise women, you know, the cunning folk and so on, and they used to say about going off in the morning and collecting herbs, and you would get a lot of stories of the wise women kind of having the Fae, you know, there's a few bits in folklore of you know, wise women that said like the Fae would tell them what plants to use, and you know, like I'm one thing about this show is I'm terrible at pronunciation. Is it like the Devas, Devas, like the plant spirit? Devas, Devas. They are connected to the spirit, and they kind of stay with the plant, but they are kind of Fae in a sense, but connected to the plant. And I don't know, like the more that I've heard accounts of that, I do kind of get that imagery of like them kind of connecting with the healers and telling them, you know, use this, you could use that, this would do this would heal that. That's always been a really area of interest for me, because obviously the witchy side, which I know obviously you're very into as well. But yeah, I think that was kind of something that I've always really been fascinated, thinking I really do think that there's that like plant spirit as well, and those messages have possibly been received over the course of time, and maybe that is why we know how to use certain things, because when you look at some of the herbs and how people figured out is to heal that, you're like, huh? Who figured that out? Who went to the methods to get that to work and thought, oh, that'll heal gout or whatever weird ailment someone had? You know, I do think there's got to be this. I do wonder, like, if there is these messages that were coming across from the divas to these wise women.
Yeah, I definitely think that. I mean, you know, that there is a massive connection between these energies, and I think that those entities do fall under Fae for me. Fae for me is just everything other than the spirits of the dead, or, you know, anything in material form, like, you know, reptilian aliens, etc., that are more in material form. But in terms of, I'm with you, I'm fascinated. It's you know, I use herbs quite a lot, and I often have that thought of how many people died while they were trying this out, you know, before they got to a stage where they knew if they steeped it in, you know, horse's urine for 3 days, that it would be all right and they could use it. It's like, who knows that? You know, who knows those quirky little things? I definitely think that that's it. And I think that when you're out in nature, you do start picking up on signs and signals when you spend time in nature that you wouldn't do in sort of the modern hub of the world. So if you spend time walking out in a woodland or a forest, you start understanding things like, you know, bird activity and what that means in terms of what weather's coming in, or, you know, and I think it does go right the way down into the to the essence of the plants as well. And you know, it's touch and go whether it's the actual plants, because I do believe that plants speak to us, as well as the energies that tend to them. You know, I think plants have a language. They want to be used, they want to be picked, they want to be respected. So yeah, it's a good subject. We could talk all night about herbs, let me tell you.
Well, I'd love you to come back on, Kate.
Yeah.
Honestly, we could talk about all day. It's really funny because you were saying about like art and the Fae, and it was something Joe talked about on Modern Fairy Sightings, about things changing around the time of the pandemic, which really got me, because I was like, I know, I don't know if you can relate on this. I think I remember you saying about this on her episode, because she was saying, you know, she started her podcast, which is I know an expansion of her work, so I know she did a lot anyway with the Fae before that. I really can resonate with this because I have no idea how I ended up starting a podcast. No idea.
Yeah.
Just before COVID, about witchcraft. No idea whatsoever. Obviously, was always a witch. And a lot of my work is tied into the Fae and their origins and the folklore. It's not like the main part of my work, but it is a big element of it. And have you found your work relating to the Fae? So I know you were doing loads in this field anyway, has kind of expanded since this time? Do you think this is a kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say like maybe a direct call from the Fae, or do you think it's a time of great change that is linked to perhaps things or something that they have engineered in relation to the earth and our treatment of it or so on? I mean, that's kind of my take on it, and I know Joe's written on that as well. Do you have any thoughts on that and what's kind of happening with them currently?
Yeah, I mean, it was very, very strange. I'm good friends with Joe, and we have talked about, and when we both found out that we both started podcasting about the same time, and we both said we've got no idea where it came out of nowhere. It's not something that I ever planned to do, and it's a bit like mind blowing. I think great change, definitely. I think my life started changing literally just before lockdown to become something that resembles nothing like it 4 years ago. I mean, 4 years ago I was teaching GCSE art in secondary setting, and that's not what I'm doing now. It's very, very different. So I think it ploughed out an opportunity for people to reevaluate. But in terms of fairies, right from the get-go, because I'd been on Chris Fleming's show, I was contacted very, very early on during COVID by a group that was setting up, and unfortunately it kind of dispelled a bit, but they were setting up a node network across the globe of people who were working with the Fae to try and bring a higher consciousness to human beings through setting up these beacons, these fairy beacons around the globe. And that's something that I'd never ever been involved in before, and that was right at the very, very beginning. And I was doing a lot of study around folklore at the time, and for me it was there were things within folklore that weren't really answering the questions that I had in a way that I felt was satisfactory. So the podcast for me was like, I was having these experiences that weren't in folklore texts. I wanted to ask people who had experiences, who work in these realms. And I was very, very lucky that I had a really good base of people at the time in the paranormal field and on the outskirts that I could interview. And nobody said no, much to my shock and horror, because I very first couple of episodes, I don't know about you, but I was a wreck. You know, I just, especially because I mean, my very first episode, I sat down with David Wells, who's he was the brilliant psychic medium on Most Haunted back in the day.
Yeah.
And lovely bloke. I had been spending time chatting with him for a couple of years before, and he said, "Yeah, I'll come on and talk to you about it." And all of a sudden, I was like, "I'm going to have to steer this conversation," but it kind of grew, and it grew to a point where a mutual friend introduced me to Neil Rushton, who is my co-host. Yeah. And we spent probably just under a year chatting before he came on for an interview. And I just asked him out of the blue. I said, you know, would you like to come on and co-host with me? And to my surprise, he said yes. And he brings such a good element. You know, he's very grounded. He's got a good academic background. He is a believer, but he's not skeptical, but he's a very critical thinker. So I get very excited about people's experiences, and Neil sort of, you know, sits and you can see his brain ticking over. He's definitely the brains of the thing at the minute. Again, I think I might have gone off on one there.
No. I'm just listening to what you're saying. So I was just thinking, I completely resonate with your timescales as well. I was just kind of thinking about your YouTube. I was thinking about what you're saying about interviewing. I could not have interviewed somebody on my first episodes. Honestly, Kate, I was an absolute nervous wreck. Like the fact that you went all in, trust me, because even today, I know you interview like regularly on your podcast, but I absolutely get like real, like, and I don't even know why, but real stage fright doing interviews, genuinely every time. So the fact that you went in straight off the bat doing that, I have to take my hat off to you. But it's really funny because, like you, I worked in recruitment for like 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years. And I was just like, I'm just going to start this little podcast just to promote. I was making like witchy candles. I was doing all this work with herbs. Yeah. Honestly, I was like, I'm just going to do a little podcast, you know, just to help promote my candles and my stuff. And it took over, and I was like, oh, I'm doing this now. And then lockdown came in, you know, furlough, and that was it. I was just doing it. I was just like, well, I can't go and do my normal job. So yeah, it was so bizarre. But I like you, I'm like, what? And when people ask me, how did you end up doing that? I'm like, literally no idea. No idea. No idea. Just here I am. But love it. But I have no idea how I kind of fell into it and can resonate with that as well. I really think as well, it's really interesting how much is kind of filtering over into art and books, and, you know, and I kind of have this little theory, and it's something me and some of the Patreons talked about, that perhaps they are kind of making themselves not known, but perhaps we're more aware of them. And, you know, maybe I do wonder if it's firstly because of the, you know, it's that Earth's call, and for us to kind of consider who else is here and stop being selfish and start doing more things and being more conscientious and looking after nature. And, you know, it needs more of us to do that and be more conscious of, you know, we should do that for the animals alone, but maybe like the Fae element as well. Like for some of us, it makes us more aware of a bigger world. But I don't know, also, you know, the world, like kind of around like 100 years ago as well, like it was quite an interesting time for things like the Fae, and strangely around the sort of like the 1920s, there was a lot of interest in, you know, spirits and Fae as well. It's quite interesting that it's like almost like 100 years on, it's like exactly the same resurgence, and there's always been an interest in it, but I do find that quite interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's the two sort of major elements, I think, and I do agree with you about, you know, the time has come where we have to consider that we're part of nature. We're not, you know, we're not disconnected from it. We can't do as we please, because it has a ricochet effect. But I think the quiet that the lockdowns afforded us, and when those first raft of lockdowns came in, they were quite severe, and you know, you were only allowed to go out for, you know, an hour's exercise a day. People were literally getting into the countryside for the first time in a long time, and taking their children for walks in nature. And I definitely saw, in the area that I was living at the time, I saw this huge popularity in people making fairy doors. So all the woods that were around and about, you know, I mean, it wasn't just one or two, there were just, you know, 50, 60, 70 fairy doors that it had this ricocheting effect. So there was a raising consciousness of that kind of energy. I also think in times of despair, whether it be the onset of wars, that people look to for comfort. And I think that the Fae were definitely there for a lot of people, even if it was just getting out and having that fresh air and appreciating nature. I mean, I don't know whether you or your listeners, you know, noticed, but during the lockdowns, wild animals they didn't become tame, but they became less frightened of human beings. I mean, I had an encounter with a young hare. I've never been up close with a hare, but it was meters away. It was one evening I was strolling along, and it was just meters away, just stood looking at me, and it had no fear of me whatsoever. And it just kind of sauntered off in the field. It didn't bolt off. But I had a couple of occasions where deer were the same. You know, you could be a few meters away from a deer, and they just seemed calmer. They didn't seem spooked by humans, they were really special encounters. But I think it was there was a lot to do with the psychic energy that period of time was creating, and how that was interplaying with people. And I think there was a certain set of people that chose to hear the calling to rise, I suppose, not above it, but beyond it, and get back into nature, and sort of attune themselves to their own authenticity. And like you know, a lot of people were either furloughed or decided, you know what, I need to change my life. I need to do some good in the world, you know, in all this panic. So it's a really complex one, but for whatever the reason is behind it, I think it had some real lovely, beautiful waves come out of it, which is good.
Absolutely. And I think what you said about animals being less fearful of us, kind of got to think that would have been, you know, if you think like hundreds of, you know, if you literally a couple of 100 years ago, less cars on the road, less pollution, all these things, that would have been a real reflection of how life was then. You've kind of got so many different, you know, sightings and different things that, you know, of the Fae and so on. So it's almost like perhaps, you know, maybe there were so many sightings documented, and, you know, all of that going on, and such a belief, because life was different than, you know, there's so much noise now, you know, and maybe it was just more easy to connect and see things because you're not so bombarded with all this other stuff. Like, that's genuinely what I like to think, you know, that we have so much that we don't even, they'll probably be waving at us half the time we're looking at our phones. So so hey, what are you working on currently? Is there anything you'd like to share that you're kind of working on project wise, or I know you've got your lovely I love your mushroom craft, honestly, but is there anything you'd like to share with us that you're kind of immersed in at the moment?
I am obviously I'm standing still round and about, and I do go out and give like I say, talks to paranormal groups and other groups who are kind of interested in the subject from that slightly, you know, odder perspective of a ghost hunter that sees fairies. I have got a secret project possibly two. I have got one secret project that I am more than happy in the next couple of months to come back when that's kind of up and running, to talk to you about. That's kind of in the ether. There's a possible other biggie sort of towards the end of this year, next year, which is going to be you know, a massive one. So other than doing, you know, those I can't talk about just yet, but there'll be more YouTube videos going up. The next one is with the lovely Dr. Simon Young, talking about the modern fairy senses, but also talking about his real passion is about boggarts and about so we have a real good in-depth conversation about what boggarts are and how they fit into fairy. So that's coming up. I mean, I've got something Fae related every month going off, so that's definitely gonna keep me busy.
Amazing. Honestly, this has been one of my favorite talks on the podcast. It's been absolutely amazing. I've loved having you on. I would be honored if you come back on and talk to us about what you're up to and herbs and whatever you'd like to talk about, Kate. Honestly, I will link all your socials, anything you like, it obviously in the show notes so people can find you. If there's anything you want to add or kind of on that front now, please go ahead. But honestly, thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. It's absolutely flown by. It's just been like sat in the living room chatting with a mate. So it's been brilliant. Thank you for that.